I never thought I'd see this when checking on my uncle. What do you do when the man you've trusted your entire life, the one you thought was the rock of the family, turns out to be hiding a secret so devastating it could tear everything apart? Da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. What I found in his study wasn't just a betrayal. It was a ticking time bomb that left me questioning loyalty, love, and the very fabric of our family. Will this truth bring us closer together or shatter us beyond repair? Stay tuned to find out, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge what you think you know about trust and betrayal. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. I never thought I'd see this when checking on my uncle. As I pushed the door open with a faint creak, my cheerful call of, "Uncle Henry, I brought you some tea," hung in the air. The dimly lit room, heavy with the scent of bourbon and the faint hint of his favorite aftershave, seemed eerily still. Then I saw him. At first, I couldn't quite comprehend what I was looking at. His shirt was half untucked, his glasses askew on the bridge of his nose, and sitting too close, far too close, was a woman I didn't recognize. She was young, vibrant, and leaning in with a smirk that sent alarm bells clanging in my head. Her hand rested casually on his knee, as though it belonged there. The tray in my hands trembled before I lost control. The porcelain cup shattered against the hardwood floor, breaking the tense silence like thunder. Uncle Henry jumped, his face a palette of guilt, shame, and something darker. Defiance. The woman, to my disgust, barely flinched. She leaned back, leisurely, her lips curling into a smile as though I had walked in on nothing more scandalous than a card game. "Sarah," Uncle Henry's voice cracked. This isn't—" He struggled to form words as he scrambled to his feet, knocking over an empty glass in the process. "What is this?" My voice was barely above a whisper, yet the weight of the question filled the room. I felt my heart hammering against my chest, disbelief coursing through me like a tidal wave. This wasn't the man who had practically raised me after my father left. This wasn't the uncle who had offered me advice, comforted me in heartbreak, and stood as a pillar of integrity. The woman stood, smoothing the hem of her pencil skirt with an air of amusement. "I should go," she murmured, her voice low and sultry. She brushed past me without a word of acknowledgement, leaving a trail of perfume that made my stomach churn. As the door clicked shut behind her, I turned to face Uncle Henry. He avoided my eyes, his hands fumbling to straighten his clothes. "Sarah, this isn't what it looks like," he began, but his tone was weak, unconvincing. I shook my head, the betrayal cutting deeper than I could articulate. "Don't insult me by lying, Uncle Henry. What is wrong with you? Does Aunt Lisa know about this?" He flinched as though I had slapped him. "Your aunt, she doesn't understand," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Things between us, they haven't been right for a long time." I opened my mouth to respond, but the weight of it all, his betrayal, the implications, choked the words before they could form. The room felt suffocating, and my eyes burned with the sting of unshed tears. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out, the shards of broken teacups crunching beneath my shoes, the tears trickling down my face, the seascape overhead purple. I didn't know where this was heading, but one thing was certain. The uncle I thought I knew was gone, and I wasn't sure I wanted to confront the man who remained. As the sun came up, I exhaled and sipped at my wine. The drive to Uncle Henry's house that morning felt like any other. The winding roads, lined with the fiery colors of autumn, were a familiar sight. It had been a few weeks since I'd visited, and Aunt Lisa had called the night before, mentioning that she'd be away for a few days. She'd asked me to check in on him, citing her concern about how lonely he might get when left to his own devices. "Henry can get lost in his head sometimes," she'd said with a laugh, but there was a strange edge to her voice that lingered in my mind. As I parked in front of their modest 2-story home, the memories came flooding back. This house had been a sanctuary for me growing up, a place where the chaos of my own home faded away. Uncle Henry had always been the calm in the storm, with his warm laugh and boundless patience. He'd taught me how to ride a bike on the gravel driveway and had once spent hours untangling the mess of my shoelaces when I was too frustrated to do it myself. In my mind, he was unshakable, a man of principle. But that idealized image had already begun to crack as I replayed the scene from earlier in the week. The woman's smirk, his guilty stammer, and the suffocating weight of silence that had followed my confrontation. I hadn't told Aunt Lisa what I saw, and now, walking up the front steps, I wasn't sure what I was even doing here. I knocked on the door, more out of habit than necessity. When no answer came, I let myself in with the spare key they'd given me years ago. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Normally the faint hum of the television or the sound of Uncle Henry's classical music records filled the air, but today there was nothing, just the faint ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. "Uncle Henry?" I called out, my voice echoing through the stillness. When no response came, I decided to check the living room. It was tidy, as always, but a faint whiff of bourbon lingered in the air. On the coffee table, an empty glass sat next to a folded newspaper, the crossword half filled. I picked it up, noting the unsteady handwriting that looked nothing like the confident penmanship I remembered. Something about it unsettled me. I ventured further into the house, calling his name again. Upstairs, the door to the master bedroom was ajar. I hesitated, a flicker of apprehension gripping me. The last time I'd walked in on him unannounced, my world had been upended. But as I peeked inside, I found the room empty. The bed neatly made. My stomach nodded as I descended the stairs, my mind racing. Where could he be? It wasn't like him to leave without telling someone. As I wandered into his study, a room that had always been his refuge, I noticed the clutter. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a faint layer of dust had settled on the bookshelves. This was unlike the Uncle Henry I knew, the man who took pride in keeping everything in its place. I started tidying up, hoping the mundane task would settle my nerves. But as I moved a stack of papers, a small leather-bound notebook caught my eye. I shouldn't have opened it, but my curiosity got the better of me. Inside were handwritten notes, lists of dates and places that meant nothing to me, but one line, scrawled in bold letters across a page, made my breath catch. "She makes me feel alive again." Stared at the words, my pulse quickening. Who was he talking about? The woman I'd seen before? I flipped through the pages, finding more cryptic entries. Some were fragments of poetry. Others were confessions of guilt and longing. It felt like I was intruding on a part of him I was never meant to see. I was startled by the sound of the front door opening. Hastily, I shoved the notebook back under the papers and stood frozen as his footsteps approached. Uncle Henry appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up with surprise. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" he asked, his tone warm but cautious. "Aunt Lisa asked me to check on you," I replied, forcing a smile. "Where were you?" "Just out for a walk," he said, brushing past me to set a grocery bag on the kitchen counter. His movements were casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was on edge. As I followed him into the kitchen, I tried to make small talk. "Have you been? The house seems quiet without Aunt Lisa around." He laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I've been fine. You know me, always keeping busy." I nodded, though his answer felt rehearsed. My gaze lingered on him as he unpacked the groceries, his hands steady but his eyes avoiding mine. The man before me felt like a stranger, someone guarded, weighed down by secrets. I decided to push, just a little. "I stopped by earlier this week," I said, testing his reaction. "You weren't expecting me." He nodded, his eyes forward, his mouth tight and slow while he chose his words carefully. He froze for the briefest moment, then resumed unpacking. "Oh, I must have been out then too." I didn't buy it, but I let it slide. The truth was, I didn't know how to confront him. I didn't know how to reconcile the man I'd idolized with the one who seemed to be unraveling before my eyes. As the day wore on, I stayed to help him clean and cook dinner. It felt like old times, but the tension between us was palpable. He seemed grateful for the company, yet there was a distance in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. Ah, that's somebody Ben. When I finally left that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The notebook, the cryptic entries, the woman. None of it made sense yet, but I knew it would only be a matter of time before the truth came to light, and when it did, I wasn't sure either of us would be prepared for the fallout. The days that followed my visit to Uncle Henry's house were a blur of restless thoughts and gnawing questions. The image of that woman's smirk and his guilty expression replayed in my mind, unraveling the carefully constructed image of him I'd held for so long. I told myself to let it go, to leave it buried, but I couldn't. The notebook with its cryptic entries gnawed at me. Every moment I spent thinking about it added to the mounting weight in my chest. Every moment I spent thinking about it added to the mounting weight in my chest. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting fiery streaks across the sky, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. If Uncle Henry wasn't going to be honest with me, I would find the answers myself. I drove back to his house, my stomach twisting in knots. This time, I told myself, I wouldn't let him evade my questions. When I arrived, the house was dark except for the faint glow of a lamp in the study. I knocked, but there was no answer. After a moment's hesitation, I let myself in. The door creaked softly as I stepped inside, the familiar smell of old wood and faint bourbon wrapping around me. "Uncle Henry?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence felt oppressive, but I pressed on, heading toward the light in the study. I found him there, slouched in his armchair with a glass of whiskey in hand. His shirt was rumpled, and his tie hung loose around his neck. The sight of him like this, a far cry from the poised, composed man I'd always known, hit me like a punch to the gut. He didn't even look up as I entered. "Sarah," he muttered, his voice heavy with fatigue and something else I couldn't place. "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk," I said, my tone firmer than I expected, "and I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth." He glanced at me, his eyes bloodshot but sharp. "What truth are you after?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Who was she? The woman I saw here the other day. His grip tightened on the glass, and he let out a bitter laugh. "I suppose there's no use denying it now, is there?" "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," I said, my voice softening. "You owe me the truth." He set the glass down with a heavy sigh and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Her name's Evelyn," he said after a long pause. "We met at a gallery downtown. She's an artist." "And?" I pressed, my heart pounding. "What is she to you?" His jaw tightened, and he looked away. "She's someone who made me feel alive again," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I know it's wrong, Sarah. I know I've betrayed Lisa, betrayed everything we built together. But I can't take it back." The room felt stifling, the air heavy with unspoken words. I struggled to process his confession, the pain and guilt etched into his face. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why would you do this?" He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't bear. "Lisa and I haven't been happy for a long time," he said. "We've been living as strangers under the same roof. I tried to fix things, but nothing worked. And then Evelyn came along." I shook my head, unable to reconcile his words with the man I thought I knew. "Do you think this makes it okay? Do you think your unhappiness gives you the right to do this to her?" "No, of course not," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I'm not proud of what I've done, Sarah. But I'm not perfect. I'm just tired of pretending to be." His words hung in the air, each one a dagger to the heart of the image I'd held of him. I wanted to yell, to accuse, to demand he explain himself, but I could see he was already drowning in his own guilt. "I found your notebook," I said finally, my voice breaking the tense silence. His eyes widened slightly and he straightened in his chair. "You went through my things?" "I wasn't trying to," I said defensively. But I couldn't ignore it once I saw it. Those words, "She makes me feel alive again." What does that even mean? Is she worth destroying everything for? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. "I don't expect you to understand," he said at last. "I don't even fully understand it myself. But Evelyn, she reminded me of who I used to be before life became so monotonous." "And Aunt Lisa?" I asked, my voice rising with anger. "What about her? What happens when she finds out? Or were you planning to keep this a secret forever?" He turned to face me, his expression a mix of defiance and regret. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what the right thing to do is anymore." "The right thing," I said, my voice trembling, "is to tell her the truth. She deserves that much." He looked away, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of my words was too much to bear. "And destroy her in the process," he murmured. "I don't know if I can do that, Sarah." I held on to his hand and smiled. I stood there, torn between anger and pity, unable to find the words to express the whirlwind of emotions raging inside me. Finally, I said, "You don't have to decide right now. But you can't keep living like this, Uncle Henry. It's not fair to anyone." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for caring, Sarah," he said quietly. "But this is something I need to figure out on my own." I left the house that night feeling more conflicted than ever. His confession had answered some of my questions, but it had also raised 1,000 more. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over, that the truth, once fully revealed, would leave none of us unscathed. The following week felt like walking a tightrope between two opposing forces. I wrestled with the idea of staying silent versus forcing the truth into the open. Uncle Henry's confession weighed heavily on me, but what haunted me more was Aunt Lisa's blissful ignorance. Could I really let her go on, unaware of the betrayal brewing in her own home? One evening, as I sat in my living room, staring at my untouched dinner, my husband, David, noticed my distraction. Sarah, he said gently, you've been miles away all week. What's going on? I hesitated, torn between unburdening myself and keeping Uncle Henry's secret. But David's patient expression nudged the words free. It's Uncle Henry, I admitted, the weight of my guilt already lighter. He's having an affair. When I'm with Tommy won. David's eyebrows shot up. Henry, are you sure? You understand? I nodded, recounting everything I'd seen and heard. David listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each revelation. Does Aunt Lisa know? No, I said, shaking my head, and I don't know if I should tell her. What if it destroys her? David leaned back, exhaling slowly. Sarah, she deserves to know the truth. His words stayed with me as I drove to Uncle Henry's house the next day. This time, I wasn't going to tiptoe around the issue. If he couldn't take responsibility, I would have to make the difficult choice for him. When I arrived, Aunt Lisa's car was in the driveway. A lump formed in my throat as I realized she was home. This wasn't part of my plan, but maybe it was fate forcing my hand. Taking a deep breath, I knocked on the door. Aunt Lisa answered, her face lighting up with surprise. Sarah, what a lovely surprise. Come in, come in. Her warmth was almost unbearable, knowing what I did. I followed her into the kitchen, where she was busy arranging flowers in a vase. What brings you by? She asked, her cheerful tone making my resolve waver. Just checking in, I said, glancing around. Is Uncle Henry here? She nodded toward the study. He's been in there all morning. I think he's working on some writing. Why don't you go say hello? I made my way to the study, my heart pounding. Uncle Henry looked up as I entered, his expression immediately guarded. Sarah, he said, his tone cautious. What are you doing here? We need to talk, I said firmly, closing the door behind me, and I mean all of us, together. His face paled. Sarah, please. No, I interrupted, my voice sharp. This has gone on long enough. Aunt Lisa deserves to know. Before he could respond, the door opened and Aunt Lisa stepped in. Know what? She asked, her eyes darting between us. What's going on? The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Uncle Henry looked at me, pleading silently, but I couldn't back down now. Aunt Lisa, I began, my voice trembling. There's something I need to tell you. Something Henry hasn't been honest about. Her expression shifted to one of concern. What are you talking about? I hesitated, but then the words spilled out in a rush. He's been seeing someone else. The color drained from her face as she turned to Uncle Henry. Henry, is this true? He stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Finally, he nodded. Yes, he admitted, his voice barely audible. It's true. You know something, don't you? Aunt Lisa's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. How could you? She whispered, her voice breaking. After everything we've been through. I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how to fix us. She stared at him, shaking her head in disbelief. Fix us? You think this fixes anything? You've destroyed everything, Henry. I felt like an intruder in their private moment, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Aunt Lisa turned to me, her eyes blazing. "How long have you known?" She, "Not long," I said quickly. "I only found out a few days ago. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't keep it from you either." She nodded, her anger shifting to a kind of weary sadness. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice hollow. "I need some time alone." "Ah, come here to me," she said, with a faint smile. She left the room, her footsteps heavy as she climbed the stairs. Uncle Henry sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. "I've ruined everything," he muttered. "Yes," I said, my voice cold. "You have." The days that followed were chaotic. Aunt Lisa stayed with a friend, leaving Uncle Henry to wallow in his guilt. I visited him once, partly out of duty and partly out of curiosity about how he was handling the fallout. "I don't know if she'll ever forgive me," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Do you want her to?" I asked. "Or is this your way of walking away without having to make the choice yourself?" He looked at me sharply, then sighed. "I don't know anymore." Yes. I left that day feeling a strange mix of pity and anger. Uncle Henry wasn't the man I thought he was, but he wasn't a monster either. He was just human, flawed and broken in ways I hadn't seen before. A week later, Aunt Lisa called me. "Sarah, thank you," she said, her voice steadier than I expected, "for telling me the truth. It hurt, but it's better than living a lie." "What are you going to do?" I asked, hesitantly. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I need to figure out what's best for me." Her strength amazed me. Despite her pain, she was determined to take control of her life, to decide her own future. It was a lesson I wouldn't soon forget. In the end, the truth didn't destroy our family, but it did change it. Uncle Henry and Aunt Lisa separated, though not permanently. They decided to take time apart, to figure out who they were without each other. And maybe, someday, they'd find their way back together. As for me, I left that chapter of my life with a newfound respect for the complexity of human relationships. Sometimes, the people we idolize the most are the ones who disappoint us the deepest. But in their imperfections, we find lessons about forgiveness, resilience, and the courage to face the truth, even when it hurts. As I stared at Uncle Henry, the weight of his betrayal settled deep in my chest like a stone. The man I had idolized, who had been my compass during life's storms, was suddenly a stranger. He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand, silencing him before he could utter another excuse. "This isn't about what it looks like," I whispered, my voice trembling with restrained fury. "It's about who you've become." His shoulders slumped, his gaze finally meeting mine with an odd mixture of guilt and defiance. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice barely audible. "Didn't mean for what, Uncle Henry? To destroy the trust we all had in you? To jeopardize the family you claimed to hold so dear?" My words cut through the silence like a blade, and I could see the sting in his eyes. He exhaled, a long, defeated breath, and for a moment, I thought I saw the man I once knew. "I made mistakes, Sarah, but don't think you know everything." His words sank into me, reaching me from within. I took a step back, shaking my head. "Maybe I don't, but I know enough, and so will everyone else if you don't end this now." The threat lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Uncle Henry nodded reluctantly, his voice a mere murmur. "You're right. It's over." But as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that the damage was already done. Some truths once uncovered leave scars too deep to heal. And as I walked away, I realized our family would never quite be the same again.